Now. Hello, everyone. Now we are going to have a conversation. Three people this time. We have Almost Zweig, we have Hassan as our guest, and myself. And some of you in the audience might remember Hassan from an earlier conversation, by the way, when we discussed morality, whether morality is objective or subjective and the things related to that. So now he's back, and today we decided we're going to discuss a new topic. The topic would be this question, which might be, you could say, sort of a famous philosophical question: does money lead to happiness? So this is a huge topic, and of course, happiness is one of the most central philosophical issues that concern literally every single human being, because happiness is always something that concern our well-being and what we desire. At least that is what I would say about that. Okay, so then we could go ahead and begin the conversation with having you, Hassan, present some of your initial thoughts or comments about this topic or question. So please begin.
Yeah, thank you, Christoffer. Yeah, so I kind of want us to delve into the question, kind of the age-old question of does money lead to happiness? It's something we always see. It's a question we always see in being asked in our society, whether or not just because someone is wealthy, does that mean that they're objectively happier? Whether that be materially or spiritually in that sense. So it's definitely something we it'd be interesting to explore and kind of see what type of conclusions we reach through this discussion. And yeah, so I can just start with, we can just start with kind of getting people's initial opinions on this question. So I can just start with you, maybe Christoffer.
Right. So, well, one thing I could start by addressing is the issue that when we talk about whether money leads to happiness, usually, at least that's my impression, it is not meant that money in itself is the issue of whether that in itself leads to happiness, but whether money can be sort of a means to bring you goods that will lead you to happiness. Of course, one might think of some hypothetical scenarios in which you have a person who enjoys money for its own sake, like that character Scrooge McDuck, who loves to bathe in money, just that act in itself. But usually it's meant, the idea is that money will make us able to purchase many different luxuries and material goods, and that then the question is, will that bring us happiness, that with which we buy with money? So I suppose that would be sort of the deep question behind that formulation of that question. So my initial thoughts would be that happiness is, well, first of all, happiness is a condition in which human beings can be in. And that condition would be, what happiness truly is, as I understand it, is the fulfillment of the human soul. Fulfillment of the human soul. That would sort of be my attempt at defining it. Now, whether you could say, do human beings have a soul? Is that soul immortal, etc.? Well, perhaps that would be very interesting questions. But even if we leave that aside and even just consider, well, we have these faculties that many would describe as spiritual, like we have a mind, we have a free will, we have desires, and the ability to think rationally. All those things would play into what many of us would classify as a soul. And I would say then that that which leads to happiness has to do with whether that fulfills our deep desires in the human soul. It has to do with what we are inherently striving towards as our ends. And that would be the necessary approach to these questions, as to all questions regarding happiness. And I would say also that when it comes to, can material wealth lead to happiness, because that is sort of the deep issue here, can material wealth lead to happiness? I would say that no, material wealth cannot fulfill the soul. Now, I would say material wealth can be useful in helping you perhaps to attain happiness, but the happiness is not located within material wealth itself. So that would be my position, basically. So yes, I suppose that could start. That could be my initial thoughts about this. So I suppose then it's you, Hassan. No, sorry, Amos. That it's you, Amos.
Yes. Yeah, I think you have made a very good outline here, and I would pretty much agree with it and say that I share a very similar position. I guess an interesting question could be, are there certain desires or things that a human being needs in order to live a good life, which money can actually help to have or to get? Because yeah, let's just make a simple example. Let's say you have a lot of good friends and you have a lovely wife and you have a child and you are very happy in your life, but then your child gets sick, and perhaps it's a kind of a complicated sickness, and so you need an expensive medical treatment to save the life of your child. Now, you can say, well, certainly if your child will survive, you will be more happy in the short run than you will be if it dies. So that could be some way in which money could help provide a goods or service that is actually helpful to your happiness. Or you could say, you can of course live in a very small apartment, but it's more comfortable to live in a bigger apartment. So does that add to your happiness? And at what point does it no longer really add to your happiness, when your apartment is just getting larger and larger? So I guess there are some interesting questions in the details, but I would also maintain the position that the things which people kind of, the ends that people strive towards, the things that they really desire for their own sake, cannot be directly bought with money. Like, for example, having good relationships or good friends. So some things can help indirectly, like if you have more money, then you have more time to spend with your friends. But unless you are actually able to have friends because you are kind of socialized to a proper degree and can do that, then the money won't really help you. So I guess that would be some initial thoughts on my part.
Yes, Hassan?
Yeah, so I would say I agree to a large extent that in terms of the, you could say what I would call spiritual experiences, or a kind of personal development, I think that cannot be bought with money, of course, and other things like, for example, having someone who having, for example, a partner that really loves you, or friends that really care about you, that cannot be bought with money. Actually, quite the opposite. Money can make those things kind of complicated, because you never know the true intentions of your partner or your friends. But I would say that in terms of what money does provide is security. When you never have to worry about, for example, being able to afford a medical bill, like in the case, for example, in the United States, or defaulting on your mortgage for your house, you have generally a lot less to worry about. And for most people, less worrying means less stress. And of course, less stress then means to greater happiness, because you don't have less stress in your life. And we often also say that a lot of our the happiness that we experience in life is shaped by our experiences. So in the case of having money, you are able to, for example, go on vacations or do things. Because you now have this money, you're able to do a lot more things that can bring positive experiences, that can raise kind of your happiness, especially if you do it with someone and you share this with someone you love, like your friends, your family. And those are, I would say, are two key ingredients for a person's well-being. Because it gives you a positive memory. It gives you a positive memory throughout your life, unlike, for example, some designer shoes that will probably go out of style in like a few years. So I would be a bit selective in terms of where exactly money can lead to happiness. Yes, in certain aspects it does, but in certain aspects it doesn't. So
many points brought up here. So one thing I would say is that material wealth is very, very beneficial when it comes to bodily needs, to fulfill things like hunger and thirst, and as you pointed out, Hassan, safety, etc. So with regards to the body, material wealth is very useful and valuable. But as I would understand happiness, since it, as I would say, is about the fulfillment of the human soul and not the body, we are thus talking about something in which happiness is found somewhere else, I would say. So the question then, I would say, immediately becomes, well, two things actually. One is, as you pointed out, almost, that we have this important distinction between means and ends. Things that are desired as means to another end, and things which are desired for their own sake. That is a very important point, because there are, of course, situations and many cases people can bring forward where people desire something, but in actual reality, it's not the thing that they desire that is actually what they truly desire, but it's rather a means to reach another end, and that is what they truly desire. And ultimately, our actions on this earth are, generally speaking, about striving towards acquiring means that we believe or are convinced will get us to some end that we ultimately desire. So then the deep question is, well, what is this deep thing that we truly desire? And there I would get into, okay, what is it that our soul needs? What is the fulfillment of that soul? Well, here I think Aristotle's idea of teleology is very, very helpful and useful. Because what is teleology? It is the idea that, by the way, it's not theology, it's teleology, just so that people in the audience don't confuse these two. Teleology is the idea that things have certain ends that they by nature strive towards fulfilling. Like you can see a seed in the ground striving towards becoming a tree, for instance, or a bush. We have the human heart pumping blood. That is what it's by nature pointing towards as its function or end, to pump blood, and many other things. And when we talk about fulfillment, that is that which the things in our soul are striving towards as its end, as its proper end. So then what are these things in our soul? Well, there are two faculties, two spiritual faculties, which are always relevant when it comes to happiness, which you could say that is what defines our human soul. That is intellect and a free will, or will. Intellect is our ability to grasp abstract truths or concepts, our ability to reason and make rational judgments. And our will is that by which we choose things, we choose to act in certain ways. So of course, these are very deep philosophical issues, but just to briefly explain my position or my argument would be that what happiness then is found in the fact that our intellect is striving towards truth. Truth, that is the end goal of our intellect, because all our actions with our intellect is about finding out what reality is about. All arguments, when we analyze that through our intellect, every time we grasp concepts, is about striving towards understanding reality, it's striving towards truth. And our will is striving towards goodness, because every single time we make a choice, every single time we choose to act deliberately, we are striving towards something that we perceive to be a good. Whether it's actually a good or not is a different issue, but it's something that we in a certain way perceive to be good. When we buy a car, when we make that choice, we perceive that it's good for me to buy that car, or else I wouldn't buy it. And that can be said of any other choice. So then the question is, okay, as the intellect is striving towards truth and the will is striving towards goodness, then it is truth and goodness which is what fulfills them. And you can put an analogy to the body. Our body is striving towards nourishment. So when we feel hungry, that's because it needs to be fulfilled by nourishment. So when we eat, we fulfill that. Or when we are thirsty, we need hydration, because that is what our body is in a certain aspect striving towards, and it needs that water, for instance, to fulfill that. So in a certain analogy to that, the soul is striving towards truth and goodness, and then truth and goodness would be that which would fulfill them and therefore leads to perfect happiness. And what is truth and goodness? How would that be received? Well, the only candidate for that, I would conclude, would be God. So that is actually the argument for why only God would be the perfect happiness for human beings. So that would be a brief explanation for my position. So then I hand it over to you, Amos.
Yeah, I would actually let Hasaan react. I would just say, because I would want him to have some speaking time as he is our guest on this show, but I would want to say that these are very interesting points that you brought up here, and I'm especially glad that you brought up this question, what does the human soul truly need? And also that teleology will perhaps teach us something about this question, because I think that's the important question that has to be looked at here. And so, for example, Hasaan's example of vacation being a form of having an interesting experience and thereby raising happiness, I would question that as really being something which truly leads to happiness, exactly based on this question, what does the human soul truly need? But I would let you speak now, Hasaan.
Yeah, so just to kind of directly answer the point with the vacations. So what I meant in that case was that you could have access to have more experiences with other people, like your friends, family, that are actually meaningful and would, I would say, bring happiness to someone, because and this doesn't necessarily have to do anything with money itself. Like you can have a nice experience with your friends. It doesn't need to cost you a lot. You can go to the park, you can, for example, go swimming at the beach. But what I'm saying is that money could would make you able to access these things more frequently, and you would have more options. You, for example, in the case of accessing it more frequently, is because you have more time. If you're wealthy, maybe you don't need to work as much as someone who is not as wealthy. And if you are wealthy, then you also have the option of instead of for example, if I were to go with my friends to the beach, and maybe that's a good experience and it'll be a nice memory, that's maybe good, but if I'm wealthy, I may be able to, for example, go all the way to the Maldives with my friends, and that could be a pretty fun experience. And not necessarily because of the money itself, but because of the experience, because of the access to an experience I otherwise would not have had because of my financial situation, if that makes sense.
Yes, but I would tend to, I guess, there is this principle in economics which is called the law of declining marginal return. So if you are, let's say you have to work 15 hours every day, 7 days every week, and you can never have even a pleasant time at the park or at the beach with a friend of yours, then it will greatly increase, I guess, your happiness if you don't have to work this crazy amount of hours every week, because it will allow you to fulfill a certain, I guess, a human desire, which is the desire for contact with other human beings. But I'm not at all convinced that you will have a better time in the Maldives with your friends than you will at the local beach, because that depends more on your relationship with your friends than on the place where you are. And also, I guess it's not true that the more time you can hang out with your friends, the happier you will be, because as we know, yeah, there is the law of declining marginal returns. So at some point, you will actually hang or be at the beach or in the park with your friends too much, and it will actually start to make you unhappy, because there will be other aspects of your life that need attention and need time or yeah, attention. And so yeah, that would be a quick reply to this point.
Yeah, so you definitely brought up some good points in regards to it being too much, and that's definitely something I would agree with, that anything anything that's kind of too much is not good for you. So I would say that in this case, it's not the only thing. I just brought it up as an example of some things that can make you happy outside of the material aspects of what we usually associate with when we ask the question of does money lead to happiness? Usually some people would answer that yes, because I can buy this and that, and and they kind of tie it to material things. So I'm trying to see it from a perspective where you can tie it to a experience that not necessarily can, yes, in a way it has been bought with money because you wouldn't have experienced it otherwise. For example, the trip to Maldives. But there's something about, if, for example, if I were to use another location as an example, let's say the Vatican, if I were to, would you say that someone would be maybe more feel more happy that they could, for example, afford to go to the Vatican versus someone who will never in their life be able to go to the Vatican because it's simply too far and too expensive to go there? So in this case, yes, the money has given them the ability to go to the Vatican, but does the fulfillment of being in the Vatican and experiencing the Vatican, is that directly tied to a material need or a material, or is it tied to the happiness that comes from money, if that makes sense?
Yeah, I see your point. I guess it would depend on that person's relationship with this location, in that example, the Vatican. So for a devout Catholic, that could actually be a very big dream to go to the Vatican one day. And so I guess I see your point. However, I still feel that if someone were really poor and he didn't have the means to go to the Vatican, even if he would really wish to do so, he could still lead a a life which he would be very happy with when he looked back upon it. It's people can very well accept that there are certain things which I do not have the means of experiencing. And also, this will not change if he has enough money to go to the Vatican. Then there will just be some other experience, which kind of is the next step in the declining returns, which he would also really enjoy, but not as much as going to the Vatican. And at some point, for everyone, there will come the cutoff where there is a certain experience which you cannot finance and therefore cannot experience. And I guess it's more productive for your happiness to learn that you cannot have everything you wish for, and really ask yourself the question, what are, as Christoffer said, what are the things that a human soul truly needs? What are really the things that are essential for a happy life, and what are kind of accidental add-ons to this thing, like making it perhaps a little more spicy or a little more enjoyable, but not being fundamentally important.
Yeah. Should I respond, or do you want to respond, Christoffer? I feel like maybe I've responded a bit too much.
Well, I can share some thoughts, and then if that's okay with Amos, I can then leave it to you, Hasaan, after that. Right, great. Okay, so yes, there are many, you could say, issues and points to comment on. Perhaps one thing I would say is that I would make a distinction between perfect happiness and imperfect happiness. Perfect happiness is when the soul is truly 100% perfectly fulfilled with receiving truth itself, because in the intellect desires truth insofar as it is true, and the will desires the good insofar as it is perceived as good. So truth in itself and goodness in itself is the goal, and that could only be acquired through that which is the infinite essential truth and the infinite essential good, and the only thing that fits with that is of course God. Now, then the other issue is then imperfect happiness, which is when you don't receive this perfect fulfillment, but you can receive a certain degree of what the soul needs. You could say truth to a certain degree and goodness to a certain degree. And here I think virtue ethics is relevant, because what virtues are about are features, positive features of the soul, which puts the soul in an order. Perhaps that would be a deep discussion in itself, the issue of virtue ethics, but a point to bring forward from this is the idea that to live a morally good life, that will involve happiness. And I think some manifestations of this is, for instance, this principle, which I'm sure both of you have heard, the idea that you will be happy if you are content with what you have, instead of always desiring more money or more luxury or more this and more that. You just are being satisfied with the amount of things you already have in life, then that will give you happiness. That I think is a manifestation of the virtue that that you, for instance, have temperance, and you seek deeper things than the merely material, because again, also the material only fulfills the bodily. It cannot really give the soul what it needs, even in a limited degree. And also another thing is that when we try to find happiness in a specific object, in a specific substance on earth, it's impossible for us to really fulfilled by that, because that thing, for instance, whether it's a car or whether it is even more experiential things like climbing a mountain, that can be very joyful, but it cannot give you that supreme or not supreme but perfect fulfillment, because those things are not the same as goodness itself and truth itself. And I think one thing that confirms this truth is that several of these things which we can find joy in, when we encounter that, we could diminish that joy by getting used to it. So for instance, let's say you win the lottery and you suddenly now you can afford a huge house, a huge mansion, compared to before when we were living in just a very small, ordinary house. Perhaps the ordinary man would be very joyful at getting such a large house and be very glad for having that and having won the lottery. But after he gets used to living in that huge mansion, over the years he will get so used to it that he might perhaps that living that mansion would have no relevance for his happiness at all. Perhaps he would become even sad, or perhaps he thinks, no, this is not enough, I need an even bigger house. I've heard that some very wealthy people even still play the lottery, even though they have money not to need that. But it's something about striving towards it, but they can never get fulfilled with it. And even experiencing a beautiful landscape at the vacation, that is joyful, and that can be joyful every time you encounter that. But let's say you watch that landscape all the time, literally. Eventually it becomes clearer and clearer that your happiness is not found in that. You can receive certain joys, but they cannot give you that deep, fulfill that deep desires. That is I think important to keep in mind. So general principles would be, yes, that true happiness comes from God alone through this argument. And when it comes to imperfect happiness, that has more to do with virtue and living an upright moral life than trying to find some specific concrete good on earth and think that this is what my soul truly desires. So if you want, Hassan, you can comment.
Yeah, a lot to unpackage. So I would kind of first start with a question of which kind of may be a bit off topic, but you mentioned that truth, from my understanding, that truth always leads to happiness. Am I correct?
That would be imprecise. I would say that having pure truth itself would involve happiness if you have truth itself.
Okay. Because it's kind of interesting that you state that, because there is a in Norway, almost may not know him, but his name is Henrik Ibsen. You know him probably, Christoffer. So he actually has this play where he kind of illustrates, I think it's called Dukkehus, which means dollhouse in Norwegian. So in this, he illustrates the.
Sorry, Hassan, could you just very briefly introduce Henrik Ibsen to the audience, and Hassan, and almost just very briefly, would that be okay?
Yeah. So yeah, Henrik Ibsen, he's a author, a Norwegian playwright, who lived in the mid 1800s. He's kind of considered one of like the founders of modernism in theater, and kind of the father, and he's also kind of considered the father of the ideology of realism. So he's a very revered figure in Norwegian society. So I think he's written a lot of plays and novels and so on. So but yeah, but kind of continuing my point, in one of his plays, he has this play which I mentioned, which I said was called Dukkehus, which means dollhouse in Norwegian. And in this, kind of the message kind of that you see throughout this play is that the truth doesn't always lead to happiness. Actually, it can be quite the opposite. It can be quite devastating. And sometimes it's better to just tell someone a white lie than state the honest truth in all cases. And I've definitely seen cases in my life where, and in other cases as well, where this definitely is the case, where sometimes the truth can be damaging or just cause unnecessary pain. Even if it's objectively true.
Yes, if I may, I could comment on that, unless you almost wanted to comment.
I would also enjoy to comment on it, perhaps.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I would definitely disagree with this message, and I think one important aspect, which so far we haven't considered, is the question of time. So are we speaking of happiness in the moment or in the very short-term future? Or are we speaking of happiness in the long-term future, or even in the very long term, like people improving their society so that their children will have a better life than themselves? And I think when we talk about the very short future, then it might be true that a person will be sadder if you tell them the truth than if you tell them a white lie, but or any lie for that matter. But in my mind, a lie is always a debt. So you kind of can think of it like you consumed certain benefits either from another person or from reality, or yeah, it must be from some other person, because you can only lie to people. You consume a benefit in the present, but then you have to pay the price with interest in the future. And so I guess in the long run, lying will, I cannot think of any case in which lying in the long run will lead to, or perhaps very, very few cases, like the Nazis come and ask if you have some Jews hidden in your house. But other than that, like in normal social circumstances, I don't think that it's ever a good idea to lie, because you hurt the other person in the long run, you hurt their personal development, you consume something in the present which you have to pay in the future, so you also hurt yourself. So I'm a big, I would strongly resist this this idea by Henrik Ibsen.
Yeah, I can just elaborate. So the thing is, most people, when kind of dealing with the time frame, most people are of course going to be on the short term. That's kind of the mindset of most people, and unfortunately, most people do not consider the long-term consequences or of the of a truth being revealed. So, for example, if I mean, you often see this, for example, in TV shows. For example, you have, for example, a married couple, and the wife asks the husband, "Do I look fat in this dress?" Kind of as it's kind of like supposed to be for comedic effect, and you know, the husband will always, of course, answer, "Yeah, of course, you look beautiful," even though she doesn't, like but telling her that no, you don't look good in the, like, yes, you actually look fat in this dress, then you know that's going to be a lot more hurtful, even though yes, in the long term, as you said, Amos, it could make her start to kind of take action to kind of rectify this issue. But that's not how you know, the wife is going to think of it. It's for you in the moment, you're going to end up very unhappy because of it, and you're definitely going to know about her unhappiness. So I think in most people, they operate within the short term, and so I think in this discussion, we kind of have to operate a bit in lean a bit towards the short term, because most people don't either they just don't have the full capacity to, or just don't want to think of the long-term consequences of whether it be happiness or truth.
Well, one thing about that specific example of the wife trying out dresses, I actually, to me, it seems, at least it's my impression, that telling the honest truth could actually be beneficial for both, in a sense, because even the wife trying out new clothes, when she asks her husband, "Do I look beautiful or ugly or fat or other things in that dress?" that question itself is directed toward knowing the truth about the issue. It's not the question itself is not meant to be directed towards getting an answer that doesn't necessarily reflect reality. So if you have a husband who is truly honest about that, you could say that it would be reasonable or rational for that wife to appreciate that honesty, because that means that when she asks her husband that question, she can always rely on him telling the truth. Because I mean, it seems to me that the point of trying out new dresses and asking the husband is to know whether she actually looks good or bad in that dress, not simply hearing the idea of her looking good if it's not actually true. So I think that's something to consider. And another point, I also think that when I talk about ugly or beautiful, that can be relative to something, relative to the dress or relative to the person, generally speaking. So if something is ugly solely because of a particular dress, that would not in itself be objectively offensive to the person, because you're only talking about the clothing and not the person. So that's also a distinction. Okay, so moving on from that, unless you wanted to comment on that specific point, Hasaan, or Amos for that matter.
I would briefly say something.
Yes.
And that is, I think Hasaan is right that most people are focused with their mind on a rather short-term vision of the future. So they generally don't think about very long consequences of actions, or but I guess when we are examining this topic and trying to find out whether money or lying actually leads to happiness, then we cannot just follow this same frame of looking at the world, because I would still maintain that it doesn't lead to happiness in the long run, even though it might be more pleasant in the short term. So, and of course, people can be in error about what they think will lead to happiness for themselves or other people, but then they are just in error. The truth is still perhaps something different.
Yeah, I would agree with that. Also, the second point that I had, kind of trying to move on from the truth aspect, because it might start to kind of go a bit off topic. So humans tend to compartmentalize their needs, and then I would then illustrate. You guys have heard of Maslow's pyramid, probably, right? Yeah. So when it comes to our needs, it can be categorized, you could say, in the pyramid, that you have our physical needs. At the bottom, you have our I'm trying to remember how the Maslow pyramid was again, because I should know this, because I've studied it in marketing. Yeah, so first you have your physiological needs at the bottom, like you need to breathe, you need water, food, shelter, and so on. And then you have your safety, love and belonging, your esteem, and then your self actualization at the very top. So in the case of, I would say, does money lead to happiness? It depends on where on this pyramid are you, in a way. So if you are, let's say you're a homeless person, you would be in the bottom here, where you are struggling to meet your physiological needs. Like you don't know when you're going to be able to eat. You don't know if you will have shelter. You don't know if you will be able to sleep somewhere safe, or have clean water, and so on. So in that case, if you give, let's say, I will just use euros as kind of a currency for metrics, since everybody here knows roughly how much the value is. So if you give a homeless person 50,000 euros, would you agree that that would make that homeless person's both life and just their general mood much happier? Because I think the key to this kind of question is, does it lead to happiness? Does money lead to happiness? Isn't necessarily to see if isn't necessarily to say that you cannot be happy if you have less money or if you're poor. It's to see if are you happier in a sense.
Well, I guess it would depend on many things, because Jordan Peterson always brings this example. If you give an alcoholic money, it will actually make his life worse, because he will just go and get drunk until he can't stand anymore. So it's really not that simple. And this also goes, I mean, of course, I understand your point that if the homeless person were sensible, let's say, then he would take this money and rent an apartment and buy some good food and get a haircut and have a shower and get clean clothes. And it would increase his comfort. And since comfort is a good sensation, you could say he would feel better or even happier. But then, of course, if he were sensible, perhaps he wouldn't be homeless in the first place. So it's all not that simple. And yeah, there's also another point that I was wanting to bring in for a long time, so I will just quickly place it here. And that is, I really believe that, like Christoffer has introduced the idea of teleology, and that every human being strives towards a goal. And I think this goal has something to do with actualizing your potential, or being that person, or that being that person which you are meant to be, in a sense. So let's say someone has a real talent for writing plays, like this Henrik Ibsen, then it is important for him to fulfill kind of this role in life and actually become a playwright. If he would have to work in a factory, he would probably be very unhappy. And perhaps another person is actually happy working in a factory because they like a simple job, and then after they are finished, they can just have some free time with their family, and they're perhaps not very intellectual. So different people have different roles that they are meant to fulfill. And I think you have to fulfill this role in order to become truly happy. And so the homeless person, if you just give them money, if they use this money in order to really become this person that they should be, in a sense, fulfill this role which they have as potential, then it would be a good thing for them. But if they don't do that and do something else, then I guess it could have a very limited effect, to say the least.
So did you want to comment on that, Hassan, or else I would comment?
You can comment, Christoffer.
Okay, right. So yes, many things to be addressed there. When it comes to the question of, well, giving that homeless person a lot of money, would that contribute to his happiness? I wouldn't say that it by itself would do so, because when it comes to money and material wealth, that is very useful and valuable when it comes to bodily needs. But being rich or poor, that by itself would not determine whether the spiritual needs of the soul are met or not. And as I argued, I would say that to attain imperfect happiness, because perfect happiness, that would be the essential good, the essential truth, God, but imperfect happiness on earth in this life, if we leave aside for the sake of the argument happiness due to religion, because that would be more of a religious issue. But if we leave that aside and simply look at it purely philosophically, I think virtue ethics is again important here, because that would be something which would improve the soul and put order towards the soul. And I think that in this context, we could include the idea of self-actualization, which Hassan mentioned, which also touched upon, again, teleology, which also almost mentioned that it is within our nature to be striving or pointing towards an end goal, which would then fulfill that aspect of our nature. And I think that is what virtue ethics is doing to an extent, because it is putting our soul in order. It is putting the parts of our soul, according to Plato. We have reason, and we have emotions, and we have our appetites. And when those three are in balance, you have order in the soul, and that would contribute to happiness, because then you don't have certain parts of your soul get out of control and creating problems for you spiritually. For instance, let's say that a person has a anger problem, that small trivial things will trigger him and make him extremely angry, a real temperament problem. By him becoming more virtuous, to control his anger, to do such a thing, to make his anger much more controlled and put that in balance and subordinate to reason, that would contribute to him somewhat more becoming somewhat more happy, because now he's not in this, his soul is no longer in this state in which his passions would disorder the soul. So it goes back to this idea that we're talking about happiness is a condition of the soul. And the question is, okay, how would the soul then be fulfilled in an imperfect sense, purely philosophically speaking? I think virtue ethics is relevant there, and therefore material wealth would not be relevant when it comes to that. And also one could point to examples of empirical cases of people who are extremely wealthy, but they are not really acting virtuously at all, and not really being happy. You could clearly see, for instance, some of these reality shows where you have extremely wealthy women in the United States, and they go on vacation and enjoy so many luxuries that others could only dream of, but yet that they constantly fight against each other and have conflicts, and they spread gossip and do all sorts of things which makes their life very bothersome and problematic. So I think we also see here that when the message to people who are unhappy, whether they are poor or rich, would be well, obviously I would say that the religious truth of Catholicism, but if we just look at it purely philosophically and leave religion aside for the sake of the argument, virtue ethics and seeking truth, seeking goodness, to the extent that is possible in this life, that is truly something that is truly valuable for attaining happiness. Yes.
Yeah. So yeah, brought up some good points, and definitely the point with you know, the example of wealthy women, was it right?
Yes,
wealthy women being
yeah.
Unhappy despite having all this wealth that others could dream of. And we see this, and we definitely have seen recently, I don't know if you maybe have followed it, but for example, in the case of Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, that's a situation where you see that, and not necessarily having all this money and wealth leads to happiness. I'm sure it's been a big headache for Johnny Depp, especially with everything that's happened. But again, I would tie that kind of, I tend to have a bit of a more pragmatic view when it comes to happiness, or at what point does would you say that spiritual needs are not kind of the first priority to be fulfilled? Because I tie the way I see it is I kind of tie to the Maslow pyramid. So a person who's, for example, living in poverty is not going to think of the spiritual aspects of whether or not their happiness, whether they are fulfilled spiritually. They just want some food, they just need some water and a place to stay and sleep. So that's going to be their first. Now you could go one level up, and then you go to safety needs, personal security, employment, resources. And I would say even then, to some extent, their spiritual fulfillment is not going to be placed that high. So my point is that we tend to compartmentalize our needs, and our needs are tied to our happiness, I would say. And having those needs fulfilled, in the case of someone who's homeless, they would, at least in the short term, be happy if they had access to, if they were able to cover their needs from a physiological on a physiological level. So I think it kind of when you I understand the point of getting spiritual fulfillment, and so on with the soul, but how does that exactly pragmatically help a person who's in poverty exactly?
Right. So to briefly comment on that, if that's okay, Amos. I would say that there, in this context, there is a separation between what the body needs and what the soul needs. So even if the body lacks, say, food, the soul could still be significantly fulfilled when it comes to perfect happiness, receiving God. That will be more of a issue in heaven, but let's just talk about imperfect happiness for the sake of the argument. You could still have a soul which is virtuous and content, even if that person is actually hungry. Even a homeless person who is hungry and even thirsty at the same time, and even if he experiences pain, perhaps he has some disease, he can actually, it's at least possible that he can actually be spiritually content and satisfied to the extent of natural level, and even if he experiences these bodily problems, he can still be in a condition in which his soul would not be inherently bothered by that, and hence he could actually be happy while experiencing that. Now, obviously, that doesn't mean that you should not eat when you're hungry, and you shouldn't, of course, injure your have injury in your body and then harm your body. That is what I'm thinking of. You shouldn't harm your body. Obviously, your body is a part of you, but its happiness is actually independent. Spiritual happiness is independent from the body, and that's why I wouldn't support that hierarchy where spiritual needs are subordinate to bodily needs. I think these are two separate issues.
Yeah. Maybe you want to, I'll just say something quick and then you can comment, Thomas. I would disagree, because I feel like if you the body always takes precedent over the needs of the body will always come before spiritual needs, because ultimately your bodily needs will affect your spiritual needs. They'll affect your psychological state. I mean, if you're living in poverty, you're not having having your physiological needs met, you will be miserable. I mean, that's just a fact of life. If you're starving, doesn't matter how much spiritual fulfillment or how much how enlightened you are, you're still starving, and that will definitely affect your mood regardless. Same with any other need that is physiological need that is not being fulfilled. Sleep, if you don't sleep, you're going to get irritable, and so on. So yeah.
Did you want to comment now, Amos, and then perhaps I could comment after that?
Yeah, it's an interesting part of the conversation here. I think it's very valuable, and I'm kind of I'm struggling to put it all in words. I have like a lot of things in my head. I think one aspect of the discussion we are having at the moment is perhaps the distinction between pain and pleasure versus happiness and unhappiness. And it seems to be in the utilitarian point of view, happiness is just kind of pain minus pleasure minus pain. So, but I think that this view has some faults, and of course I don't think Christoffer or I would argue that a person who is hungry should kind of sit there and meditate and try to be calm and at peace with the world when his stomach is grumbling. No, he should of course go and try to get some food. But I guess still I would also maintain that, or I think that's very difficult to say if you haven't been in the situation yourself, but at least you could have two possibilities. So for example, this this person in this case could really strive towards getting a job and therefore getting something to eat, or he could steal the food from another homeless person who is even weaker than he is. And I guess the first option would be more in line with keeping your conscience pure. And I think Peterson talks about this a lot, that experiencing hardship isn't necessarily the same as being unhappy, because struggling through something difficult when you have a goal of something good in vision which you strive towards, then the struggle through the difficulty can actually give you meaning. And meaning, Peterson talks a lot about meaning and how meaning is very important. And he even goes so far as to say that he doesn't believe in this scheme of the Maslow pyramid, because meaning is more important than having all your bodily needs met, because you can have all your bodily needs met, but have no meaning in your life, and you will suffer pointlessly, and it will be a very bad experience for you. So I think these are a couple of the thoughts in my head around this topic, kind of convoluted, but here they are.
Yeah, I would say that, again, I definitely agree with your point that it's very hard for us in the position that we are in to kind of really comment truthfully of, given that, you know, probably none of us have, you know, experienced poverty. So it's a bit difficult and to kind of answer in that regard, because I would say that most of us, when it comes to, for example, in going by the Maslow pyramid, would be somewhere on either the step just below the top of the pyramid, or at which is esteem, and then you have under that in the middle you have love and belonging. So some of us would be, most people I think would be in the love and belonging, because esteem, that's a bit difficult to attain. You know, we aren't, some people aren't entirely confident, like they still have insecurities and so on. But yeah, but kind of taking it back to the happiness aspect, the way I view it, the way I would view happiness is to have your needs fulfilled. Now, that does not mean that you cannot experience hardships, but those hardships, I think, cannot be at the base level. Because if they are at if those hardships are at the base level, that means at the base level of the Maslow pyramid, the physiological needs, then everything else kind of does not matter at that point. You kind of go into a fight or flight mindset. So it's kind of, as an example, to kind of illustrate this is, for example, if you have an exam, if you were told that you have an exam tomorrow, and you need to succeed to get into, for example, your number one, your first choice of university, and someone decides to you know, send you a message and say, hey, do you want to hang out today? Of course, you're going to prioritize studying for that test and not going to maybe not even answer that message, because you're so busy and stressed out with trying to study as much material as possible to be able to succeed. So the message that you would receive would be, and your friends asking you to hang out would be secondary. You're not going to even yes, it's a you know, socialization, it's an important aspect of life, but it's not going to be something that is considered if you have something that is more pressing. And that's kind of my point, is the physiological needs are more pressing. So if those needs are not met, the other steps above will not matter.
So I would say that, examples like putting a friendship aside for the moment to have a test, well, that wouldn't be an analogy, because spiritual happiness is not the same thing as having spending time with friends. But I would rather say that one could go and seek bodily fulfillment, like a hungry person seeking food or a thirsty person seeking water. He can strive towards that, while at the same time having spiritual happiness and contentment. So you can actually have both at the same time. And I do not agree that a person who is very poor will necessarily become miserable and be bothered by it necessarily. No, I think you can actually be very spiritually content while at the same time being even very poor. Now, you could argue that, well, it's possible that your bodily problems, that you can let those bodily problems affect you spiritually. But but in that case, that's a spiritual problem by letting the bodily problems affect your spiritual life. But you can actually separate those two and be spiritually fulfilled while having poverty and living in that. And if you permit me, I could share a brief story from history of a very brilliant example of this. It is a Catholic history, but Catholicism is not the point I'm drawing with this story. It's rather a general point about being very poor and living content. So there was a Catholic priest named John Towler, and he went to the building of a church one day, and he found a beggar who was barefooted and had very poor and bad clothes. So a very poor beggar. And the priest greeted this person saying, "Good day, my friend." And the beggar responded, "Thank you, sir, for your kind wishes, but I do not recall ever having a bad day." Then God certainly has given you a very happy life. And the beggar said, "That is very true, sir. I have never been unhappy. In this, I am not making any rash statement either. This is the reason. When I have nothing to eat, I give thanks to God. When it rains or snows, I bless God's providence. When someone insults me, drives me away, or otherwise mistreats me, I give glory to God. I said I have never had an unhappy day, and it's the truth, because I am accustomed to will unreservedly what God wills. Whatever happens to me, sweet or bitter, I gladly receive from his hands what is best for me. Hence my unvarying happiness." And it also continues a little below. The beggar says, "I am a king," and he is asked by the priest, "Well, where is your kingdom?" "In my soul, where everything is in good order, where the passions obey reason, and reason obeys God." How have we come to such a state of perfection? By silence. I practice silence towards men while I cultivate the habit of speaking to God. So this I find to be a very great and excellent story of illustrating the point that you can be a very poor person, even a very poor beggar like this guy, and being happy. He said that he has never had a bad day, and etc. And yes, you have to hear the story. So yes, that is what my position would be on this issue.
I would
Yeah.
like
Yeah,
to
go on.
I would like to oppose perhaps another view, because I think this view is valuable, and for some people this is an approach that works for them, the one that Christoffer has presented right now. But I guess it's not for everyone, and that's also okay, I think. So I would like to present more, not the idea of spiritual happiness, but of having meaning or a goal to which you strive. So let's take the example of a guy that really envisions himself as being a comedian. This is kind of his goal or his calling, and he really feels that this is what he is meant to be, or this is what he is best at or enjoys most doing. And there have been people who, or there has been a guy, I think I read this story somewhere, who lived in his car in a garage in New York for, I think, over a year. And he only ate like bread and drank water. And kind of because he was pursuing his goal of being a comedian. And he was not unhappy during this time, even though his bodily needs were at the absolute minimum. Now you could say if he were starving, then he would be unhappy. Yes, probably, but then he would perhaps take a short job until he has just a little bit of money to buy some food, and then he would immediately pursue his dream of being a comedian again. And I think as long as you do not give up on that which you truly believe is your vocation or the thing you are meant to do, then you will be happy even if you have a materially poor life compared to other people. So yeah, I guess that would be a kind of a second example.
Hasaan?
Yeah, I would tend to somewhat agree. Although I still maintain my more pragmatic position when it comes to this, because and I definitely agree with almost that, you know, regarding the story that you told. Again, I think that's an exception, and an exception does not make the rule. So I would still maintain. I'm trying to remember my point, because I was so focused on listening in that I kind of forgot my my argument.
No worries. I may take
Yeah.
over, and then you can come back when you remember your point. I guess, or the way I would understand your argument is that you would say, well, yeah, these are exceptions, but for most people, this Maslow pyramid actually applies, and they feel happier when they have these needs met rather than not.
Yeah. Yeah. Now I just remember. Yeah. So in a way, my basic point is that, you know, spiritual fulfillment is a bit of a luxury, and if you, as stated, if you're oh, sorry, Siri, my phone activated. But yeah, anyways, so if your physiological needs are not being met, then everything else becomes a luxury at that point. So that's kind of my point, that spiritual fulfillment will always be secondary to your bodily, your material and bodily needs. Because if, as stated, if you don't have the foundation fulfilled, you cannot, you will not have the capacity to explore other things outside of that.
If I may briefly react to that, I guess I would agree that most people view the world the way you have expressed it right now. And you have said something interesting a little bit earlier, where you said our needs are tied to our happiness. And I think that is true. And I would, however, say that this idea that spiritual fulfillment is a luxury and physiological needs are more important, I think this is a wrong notion. And when people have a wrong notion, then they might be unhappy because they think this need is more important than the other one, and so they pursue it with priority. But that doesn't mean that they are correct just because they think it is so. And there are interesting examples. For example, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, who was a Russian guy who was in the Gulag in Soviet Russia, and he wrote a huge book about the Gulag system. And he mentions this example of a person who refused to have a comfortable job in the Gulag, in the washing room, like washing the clothes of all the communists. And he would rather go out in the forest and freeze his fingers off and chop wood, because he said, I will not wash the socks of these people who I despise. And then some of his friends told him, come on now, be reasonable. I mean, you will die in the forest. Why don't you just wash these socks? Why do you care about this? But he said, yeah, well, I just won't do it because it's more important to me to have my integrity than whether or not I will remain alive. And I guess this
Again,
is,
that
yeah, I mean, I cannot say I would have the strength to do it, but I guess this is a better approach to life when life is very difficult than the one you have presented, and that probably most people today believe to be true.
Yeah, but again, that person, as stated with in the example of Christoffer's story, are exceptions to the rule. So I'm trying to see what most people would do, or what is what would be considered practical for most people to do. In this case, it would be just that most people would have just washed the clothes. Yes, their dignity might be somewhat damaged because of it, but because they despise the people that live there. But I mean, why you know, why, what do you want to increase your own suffering in that case? I think that's the question that people would rather choose humiliation than suffering if it came down to it.
People would rather choose humiliation rather than suffering?
Yeah, because it's, well, in this case, it's a small, you could say, and it's, again, it's their perception of, it's not whether or not it's subjectively humiliating, but it's their own subjective perception of this task being humiliating. And in his case, washing the socks of people he despised is humiliating to some extent. So I think most people would rather set the humiliation aspect aside for so that they do not suffer, which they would view as worse than experiencing some like, and this kind of comes to you know, where do you rank kind of displeasure in this case? You would rather face the displeasure of having this mildly humiliating task of washing the socks of people you dislike than potentially going off and freezing to death.
Well,
that would be the choice of most people, I would say. Yeah, sorry.
That's okay. That's interesting because I have actually the opposite impression, that many people would rather choose suffering compared to humiliation. Isn't there this human tendency that many people who are living in deep poverty would rather choose to live in deep poverty than to ask either the government or friends or family for money because it's humiliating? At least that's my impression, that there is this tendency. But even if that's the case, as you say, Hasaan, that people choose humiliation compared to suffering, even if we grant that, I would still say that my position is that which would reflect the nature of the body and the nature of the soul in a human being. And when it comes to these stories, I wouldn't agree that they are exceptions. There are other stories as well that one can point to, but even if we grant that it is, for the sake of the argument, we grant that there are exceptions to a rule, still it would still show that it is possible for a human being to live in deep poverty and things like that and still be spiritually satisfied. Even if just a small minority actually do so, it's at least possible. Now, perhaps a counter argument could be, well, that simply means that some people are able to do so, but others are not. But I would actually disagree, because all human beings share the same kind of soul. We have intellect, we have will, we all have passions and emotions. So these things are general truth about the body and the soul, which people generally speaking can act upon. So I would say that what it comes down to, and this is I would say applicable to the human beings in general, not just particular individuals, is that if they are, say, living in poverty, that yes, that they shouldn't not try to feed themselves, of course, but they can actually live in poverty, even be hungry, and still be spiritually content if they are willing to acquire virtues, if they are willing to acquire virtues that would not let their bodily problems get in their way of their spiritual contentment. Because it gets down to sort of a choice about, are you going to let your hunger bother you spiritually, or are you going to leave that out? Perhaps a little bit analogous to this is this problem of a person who is struggling with rage or anger and has a high temperament. He has a choice whether he will acquire the virtue of controlling his own anger and not letting that get into the way of his spiritual health, or whether he's going to do so. So I think that is the issue, and that's why not only is that a reasonable and true truth, in other words, but also it's very liberating, because that means that all those people in the world who live in poverty, even extreme poverty, it's a good and consoling message to think that I don't really need to have drastic improvements in material wealth to be happy. I can actually be happy where I am just right now, even if I'm living in poverty and even if I'm struggling with a disease, etc. I think that's a very helpful and good message for people to receive, and it's true. It's a true message.
Yes, I would like to add briefly to this. I think you formulated it well, and I would kind of formulate it in my own words that this is a very basic question for a human being, whether you will put a higher priority on your spirit or your conscience, or your spirit, your conscience, your soul, or on your body. And I think, and also Alexander Solzhenitsyn says this in his book, that sometimes people who put their emphasis on the spirit, they died, and sometimes also people who put their emphasis on the body, they died. But he said that some people have been really grown as individuals from this experience in the Gulag, whereas others have become more and more like beasts, like animals. And the difference was exactly the choice whether you prioritize your soul or your body higher. And I guess I would agree with you, Hasaan, that most people prioritize their body higher than their spirit. So most people would wash the clothes instead of risk injury, or most people will make white lies, and most people perhaps think that money will make them happy, but that doesn't mean that it's actually true. And I think the deeper truth is that you should not neglect your body. You should take care of your body, but you should take care of your soul even more. This has higher priority. And I guess this is, for me, a great thing that Christianity has really fleshed out, perhaps compared to the Stoics, who say basically you should disregard your body completely and only care about your rationality. I think you should care about your body, but you should care about your soul even more. And that's the deeper truth. And it doesn't matter if most people believe it or not. I still think that it's true.
Indeed. By the way, Hasaan, you wrote that you don't have much time left.
Same here.
Yeah, I have to leave in a bit, unfortunately. I need to help out with some wedding planning, so.
But give us your comment on this point which we have reached, and then that would be perhaps a good place to stop.
Yeah, just before you do that, Hasaan, shall this perhaps be our last remarks and then we end the conversation?
Yeah.
Sure, then we'll do so.
Okay, so I will just conclude with to answer the question whether or not does money lead to happiness? Again, you've shown, of course, examples of people who have been able to, despite all odds, show that they can be spiritually fulfilled. But my view is that to be able to answer the question yes or no, does money lead to happiness, then I believe it should be applicable to most people in this case. So that is kind of my view going into this topic. I don't disregard that there are, of course, people who are able to, despite not having certain needs met, can be happy. Like, for example, in the case of the guy who was in the Gulag, who decided to chop wood rather than do a comfortable task like wash clothes. But yeah, I believe most of these are exceptions, and even if, as you said, granted, even if we accept that, then it still shows that people are able to find happiness despite not having despite not having certain needs met. But I don't believe that's most people, and that's kind of what I'm sticking to. Is I'm kind of sticking to what most people would do in such a situation.
But let me ask you just very briefly and directly. I agree that most people would do as you say, and most people believe perhaps that a certain amount of money will make them happy. But do you believe that this is actually true?
Because, me personally?
Yeah, because it doesn't matter if many people believe it, it matters if it's true.
Yeah, to some extent, I do believe it. I believe when you go back to the Maslow pyramid, I believe that in the case of the homeless person, I do believe that, yes, giving them, like I mentioned, 50,000 euros would make them happy. While not happy in the long term, perhaps, most people do not think in the long term, or just don't have the capacity to properly think in the long term. Most people think very short term. They might think that they think in the long term, like someone might say, I have a 5-year plan and for this and that. But even still, that is considering your lifetime. That's a short time. You don't see people exactly planning for, considering the consequences of their actions 20 years in the future. If people thought in the long term, I think we would avoid a lot of trouble and a lot of pain in this world if people actually did take the time to think about the long-term consequences of their actions.
Okay, so do you want to have your final remarks, Amos, or should I take it first?
I think I made my final remarks already. I would perhaps just say to what Hassan has said that I guess he is right. And since we have said that happiness is kind of a subjective emotion, perhaps it's really true that giving some people money makes them happy in the sense that they have this sensation in the short term. But I guess I would argue it doesn't make them happy in the long term, but that might be like different aspects. But other than that, I think I have made my concluding remarks.
So I would say that, to the argument just discussed here, I would say that all people have the possibility of being spiritually condemned regardless of what material condition they're in. It's very true that that few people are actually doing that there are so many people in the world, the vast majority, who let material problems get in the way of spiritual happiness. But it's not because they are unable to do otherwise. They can choose to live virtuously and be happy even if they are very poor. And that is true of everyone. So that is an important point. And the deeper point, which I have put forward in this discussion, would be that happiness is fulfillment of the human soul. So it is a condition of the soul in which it is fulfilled. And what means that? What does that mean? Well, again, as we have discussed, the soul is striving towards certain things as its final end. We have an intellect which is striving toward truth itself, and a will which is striving towards goodness itself. So that reflects the deep desires of our soul. Therefore, the only thing that can give us perfect happiness is that which is pure truth itself and pure goodness itself. And that is, there's only one candidate for that, and that is God. And that's why I would argue purely philosophically that God is the only one which could give people perfect happiness. Now, when we're talking about imperfect happiness on earth, only on the natural level and not on the supernatural level, that involves virtue ethics. Because virtues are about putting the soul in order and not letting material problems get in the way of your spiritual happiness, as discussed, and letting your passions be subordinate to reason and all these things. That gives a person a good life. Now, of course, I would argue that a real true happiness on earth involves a Catholic holy life. So that is also something I, as a Catholic, would absolutely say. Now, other things also. Is that yes, these stories that we've discussed, including the story I put forward, is an example of how people are actually able to be spiritually content and happy, even if they're materially poor. And I wouldn't say all these are just exceptions, because these are possibilities everyone can think about and acquire such a state. And also another point on poverty. I would actually argue that it's more advantageous for the soul if you are poor than rich, because when you are poor, you have the opportunity to become more virtuous and let material distractions not get in the way as much as people who are rich, who are more inclined to be materialistic and less virtuous. So poverty is actually advantageous. Right, so those would be my final remarks. It has been a very interesting and productive conversation. I thank both Amos and Hassan for participating. And I hope also the audience find this interesting and fruitful. So I would then end by saying thank you, both of you, for joining again. And yes, I'll then just say have a great Friday and a great weekend to the both of you.
Yes, thank you very much. I found the conversation interesting and valuable as well. And yeah, I wish you all and the audience a great weekend and see you soon.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I definitely think it's been an interesting discussion. I think it's kind of still somewhat unresolved. So I'd really like for there to be kind of a part 2 to this, because I have some interesting points, other interesting points that I wanted to share in my notes, but we didn't have the time for it. So definitely, if there's a part 2, I'd be happy to join again.
Okay, then we will end the Zoom now, I suppose.
Yes.
Unless
goodbye, everyone.
Yes, okay. Goodbye, everyone.
Bye.